I turned 63 last April, and my daughter gave me a birthday card that said, "Dad, you're the rock of this family." I kept it on the kitchen counter for weeks. Looking back now, I think she meant it. I just didn't realize at the time that her husband had a very different definition of what a rock is for. Something to stand on, not someone to respect. My name is Frank Alderman. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county, retired with a decent pension, and when my wife Helen passed 4 years ago from a sudden stroke, I made a decision that surprised even my closest friends. I didn't fall apart. I grieved, genuinely and deeply. But I also got up every morning, made coffee, walked 2 miles around the neighborhood, and kept going. Helen would have wanted that. She was the most practical woman I ever knew. The house is mine outright. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, on about 3/4 of an acre in a quiet part of Greenfield, Ohio. We bought it in 1991 for $112,000. It's worth considerably more now. I keep it up. New roof 2 years ago. HVAC replaced last spring. The landscaping is something I genuinely enjoy. I spend Saturday mornings out in the yard the way other men watch football. It's my place. Mine and Helen's, really. But since she's gone, it's where I keep her memory close. My daughter Joanna is 34. She's smart, genuinely funny when she's relaxed, and she married a man named Clifton 3 years ago in a ceremony that Helen would have loved. I liked Clifton well enough at the wedding. He was charming, attentive, made a speech that made Joanna cry. I shook his hand and thought, okay, this is who my daughter chose. I'll make this work. What I didn't understand then was that Clifton had a way of making things work. For himself, he had a nose for resources, the way some men have a nose for opportunity. He noticed things, square footage, property values, how much a house might rent for. Within 6 months of their wedding, he'd already asked me twice about eventually adding on to my property, once framed as a guest suite, once as an investment we could do together. Both times I smiled and changed the subject. I'm patient. I learned early in my career that the most dangerous problems are the ones you dismiss the first time you see them. They were living about 40 minutes away in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus. Joanna worked in hospital administration. Clifton was in sales, pharmaceutical, then medical devices, then something with tech. The specifics shifted every time I asked. He was always about to close something big, always on the verge. I stopped asking after a while. Their son Oliver was born about a year and a half into their marriage. He's a beautiful kid, 2 years old now, all dark curls and a laugh that fills a room. I drive up to see him every other week. Being a grandfather is something I didn't know I needed until it was happening to me. The first time Clifton mentioned his parents, it was casual. We were at my kitchen table after Thanksgiving dinner. Joanna was putting Oliver down for a nap, and Clifton poured himself another glass of wine and said, "My folks are thinking about downsizing. They're in that big house in Dayton. It's just the two of them, you know how it is." I said I did. "They're paying about $1,400 a month in property taxes alone," he said. "It's a lot for retirees." I nodded and said that was common. He looked around my kitchen. "Not subtly. You got all this space, Frank. 4 bedrooms, and it's just you." I looked at him for a moment. "It is just me," I said, "and I like it that way." He laughed it off. Just thinking out loud. But Clifton was never just thinking out loud. I understood that about him. Everything he said was a test, a probe, a first pass at something he planned to come back to. I followed the conversation and moved on. He came back to it in February. This time, Joanna was in the room. They'd driven down for Oliver's checkup with a pediatrician nearby. Joanna trusted our local practice more than the one near their apartment, and afterward they came to the house for lunch. We were eating soup and sandwiches when Clifton put his spoon down and said, with the careful tone of a man who has rehearsed something, "Frank, Joanna and I have been talking. My parents are in a real tough spot." I waited. Dad's had some health stuff, his back and now his knees. They can't keep up with that house in Dayton, and they're not in a great position financially. Joanna was looking at her soup. We've been thinking, Clifton continued, that the most practical solution for everyone will be for Harold and Bev to stay here with you, temporarily, just until they figure things out. There it was. I put my sandwich down and wiped my mouth with a napkin. I have learned over 63 years that the first thing you say in a difficult moment matters enormously. I took a breath. I hear that your parents are in a hard spot, I said. That's genuinely difficult, and I'm sorry for them. But they won't be staying here. Clifton blinked. He clearly hadn't expected that. Frank, just hear me out. I did hear you out, I said. The answer is no. Joanna finally looked up. She seemed caught between relief and anxiety. She knew her husband well enough to know what was coming next. What came next was a slow campaign. I want to be honest about this. Clifton was patient in his way. He didn't blow up at that lunch table. He said okay, he understood, and the afternoon ended politely enough. But over the following 6 weeks, I received calls from Joanna on subjects that always, somehow, circled back. His parents needed this. His parents needed that. Didn't I have all that space? Wouldn't it be nice for Oliver to have grandparents nearby? I love my daughter, but I recognized the script. Then Clifton called me himself, one Thursday evening in March, and the patience was thinner this time. Frank, he said, I need you to think about this seriously. My parents are looking at moving into a facility, and frankly, it's going to run them $2,500 a month minimum. That money doesn't exist, and meanwhile you have 4 bedrooms. Clifton, I said, my house is my home, not a solution to someone else's housing situation. They're family, he said. They're your family, I said, which means this is your responsibility, not mine. The line was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a cold thing to say, Frank. It's an honest thing, I said. He hung up without saying goodbye. 3 days later, Joanna called me crying. I sat in my kitchen chair and listened to my daughter tell me that Clifton's parents were going to have to go into assisted living, and it was going to break up their savings, and wasn't there something I could do? I told her I loved her. I told her I was sorry this was hard. I told her that my answer hadn't changed. After that call, I did something. I called my old friend Warren. We'd worked together in the county engineer's office for 15 years. And he'd gone into property law when he retired from engineering. We had lunch. I told him everything. He listened with the focused quiet of a man who has heard complicated situations before. You don't owe them anything legally, Warren said. In Ohio, there's no filial responsibility statute that would apply here. Your son-in-law can't compel you to house his parents. I know, I said, but I want to understand my options, because I don't think this is over. Warren nodded slowly. Document everything, he said. Every conversation, every call. Keep notes with times and dates. If this escalates, you'll want a record. That night I started a document on my laptop. I titled it simply Record, and I wrote down everything I could remember from the beginning. It took 2 hours. When I finished, I sat back in my chair and looked at what was on the screen and thought about how something that had started as a casual comment at a Thanksgiving table had become something I needed to document, like a legal case. The escalation came in April. Clifton called on a Saturday morning while I was in the garden and left a voicemail I almost didn't listen to. When I did, I sat down on the back porch steps. He had looked up Ohio tenant rights. He had read something somewhere about how long a person could stay somewhere before establishing residency. He had, and this was the part that made me sit down, suggested in a tone of forced calm, that if his parents came to stay, and they were there long enough, then things might get complicated for me to ask them to leave. He was threatening me with a squatter's rights argument about people who hadn't moved in yet. I called Warren that afternoon. Warren was quiet for a long moment and then said, Frank, that's not how that works in Ohio. But the fact that he's saying it means he's planning something. You need to be careful about what happens next. What happened next was that I installed a security camera system. 4 cameras, front door, driveway, back door, side gate. A system that recorded to the cloud automatically, stored 30 days of footage. A technician installed it on a Wednesday. Cost me about $800. It was the best $800 I ever spent. The following Saturday at 7:15 in the morning, Clifton's car appeared on my driveway camera. He was alone. He rang the doorbell. I was already awake. I am always awake by 6. And I watched him on my phone's camera app for a moment before I answered. I opened the door. He looked like he hadn't slept well. "We need to talk," he said. "Come in," I said. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where this had all started at Thanksgiving, and he told me that his parents had given notice at their house in Dayton, that they had nowhere to go, that he and Joanna didn't have space in their 2-bedroom apartment, that he had run out of options, and that I was the only solution. "Clifton," I said, "I've told you no 4 times now. The answer hasn't changed. You're going to let an elderly couple end up in a situation where I'm going to maintain appropriate limits around my own home," I said. He left angry, and then the call started in earnest. Over the next 3 weeks, I received 41 calls from Clifton's number. Some I answered. Most I did not. He left 22 voicemails. I saved every one. They ranged from frustrated to pleading to, by the 4th week, genuinely alarming. One, left at 11:45 at night, included language I won't repeat here. Another, left on a Tuesday morning, suggested he might have to take legal steps without specifying what those steps were. Another told me I was a selfish old man who didn't deserve that house. I forwarded every voicemail to Warren. Warren listened to all of them and then called me. "Frank," he said, "this man is building a case against himself. You understand that?" I said I was beginning to. Keep saving everything. The morning of April 22nd, I woke up to a sound in my driveway. It was not quite 5:30. I looked at my phone and pulled up the camera app. On my driveway camera, in the gray pre-dawn, I could see Clifton's car. He was parked there, just sitting. I called Warren. Warren said, "Call the non-emergency police line and document the time." I did. An officer came by about 20 minutes later, spoke to Clifton, and he left. But I had the camera footage, time-stamped at 5:27 a.m. I added it to the record. The next morning, there was a letter in my mailbox. Not through the postal service, hand-delivered. It was from Clifton, typed, 2 pages, citing a document he claimed to have found about familial moral obligation and housing support duties in blended families. It was not a legal document. It was not written by a lawyer. It contained several factual errors about Ohio law. I scanned it and sent it to Warren, who called me back laughing, which is not something Warren does often. "He wrote this himself," Warren said. "There's no legal basis for any of it." "I know," I said, "but I want it in the file." Here is what I had not told Clifton. Here is what I had not told Joanna, because she would have told him, while all of this was happening, while Clifton was calling 41 times and parking in my driveway before sunrise. I had been having a different set of conversations entirely. A woman from my church, Beverly, had mentioned to me at a Sunday service in March that her neighbor was a property manager who specialized in senior affordable housing. I had taken down the name and number. I called the following Tuesday. His name was Art Kaminsky, mid-40s, patient, thorough man who had spent 20 years navigating HUD programs. Section 200 and 200, 1600 sections programs in Ohio. I met him at his office on a Wednesday afternoon and I told him the situation. An elderly couple in Dayton, limited finances, needed a place. Art did not blink. "This is literally what these programs exist for," he said. He pulled up several options on his computer. There was a senior housing community in Miamisburg, about 12 miles from where Clifton's parents currently lived in Dayton. with a two-bedroom unit available, rent adjusted to income, utilities included, a community room, a nurse on call 3 days a week. The monthly cost for Clifton's parents, based on what Clifton had told me about their income, would be approximately $410 per month. $410, not $2,500, the figure Clifton had thrown at me to create panic. 410. Art helped me understand the application process. I did not apply for them. That wasn't my place. But I gathered all the information, printed it out in a clear packet, including contact numbers and a pre-filled checklist of documents they'd need. I gave that packet to my daughter Joanna. On a Thursday afternoon when Clifton was at work, I drove to Columbus, met Joanna for coffee, and I slid the packet across the table to her. She looked at it for a long moment. "Dad," she said. "Read it," I said. She read the first 2 pages. Her eyes went to the monthly cost figure. "Clifton told me it would be $2,500 a month minimum," she said. "I know what Clifton told you," I said. She was quiet. I watched my daughter in that moment, and I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not everything shifted. Marriage is complicated. Loyalty is complicated. And Joanna had been living inside Clifton's version of this story for months. But something shifted. "He knew this existed?" she asked. "I don't know what he knew," I said. "I only know what he told you." She took the packet home. She did not tell me what happened. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing from Clifton. Not a single call. I went about my life. I worked in the garden. I visited with Oliver on a Saturday, and we built a birdhouse in my garage, just the 2 of us, which took most of the afternoon and turned out somewhat crooked, and I couldn't have been prouder of it. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late May, Joanna called me. Her voice was very even, the way her mother's voice used to get when she was working to stay composed. "His parents applied," she said. "They got the apartment in Miamisburg." "That's good," I said. He's pretty upset. I imagine. He says you went behind his back. I chose my words. I gave your mother's daughter information that was true and useful. That's all." Joanna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, did you know all along that this was an option?" "No," I said. "I found out in March when I started looking. But I found out because I looked. I looked because I was trying to find a real solution instead of making someone's problem my problem." She was quiet again. Then, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have." "You were in a hard spot," I said. "You don't need to apologize." What happened in the months after that is complicated in the way that families are complicated. Joanna and Clifton went through a period that she described to me, carefully, as figuring things out. I didn't press. There was a weekend in June when Joanna brought Oliver to stay with me for 4 days while she and Clifton had what she called some conversations, and those were 4 of the best days I've had in a long time. Oliver and I drove to the state park and walked the trails, which he took very seriously for a 2-year-old, stopping to examine every stick and rock with the focus of a scientist. Clifton's parents moved into the apartment in Miamisburg in July. I learned this from Joanna. I have not spoken directly to them. By August, Joanna told me that she and Clifton were seeing a counselor. That was her choice to share, and I honored it by simply saying I was glad they were talking to someone. And then one Sunday in September, Joanna brought Oliver to my house for what she said was just a visit. She came alone. Clifton had his own plans that day. We sat on the back porch after Oliver went down for his nap. He sleeps in Helen's old sewing room now, which I turned into a proper guest room 2 years ago. Soft yellow walls. And Joanna said to me quietly, "He told me in February that there was no other option. That assisted living was the only thing, and it would cost them everything. He said that if you wouldn't help, they'd have nothing." I waited. "He knew about the program," she said. "The counselor, she helped me understand that. He'd looked into it. He knew about the senior housing options. He wanted your house, Dad. He wanted us to move in with you eventually. His parents were the beginning of that. I looked out at the yard. The roses along the back fence were still in bloom. Late this year, I think, because of the odd summer we'd had. Helen had planted those roses the second year we lived here. I know, I said. You knew. I suspected, I said. That's why I started documenting things. Joanna looked at me with an expression I recognized. She used to make it as a child when she discovered that I had already known something she thought was a secret. A mixture of exasperation and something almost like relief. Dad, she said. Joanna, I said. We sat there for a while without talking, which is something I've always been able to do with my daughter, even when things are difficult. The afternoon was warm and the yard smelled like cut grass in the end of summer, and from inside the house we could hear, faintly, the particular quiet breathing sound Oliver makes when he's deeply asleep. I want to say something here to anyone who's listening to this, because I think it matters. I did not win anything. I want to be clear about that. My daughter is working on her marriage. Clifton's parents are in a decent, affordable apartment that suits their needs. My house is still my house. Oliver still comes to build birdhouses in my garage. None of this is victory. It's just life being complicated in the way life is, and then becoming slightly less complicated because someone in the situation decided to think carefully instead of react. The 41 calls are still in my phone. Warren has copies of everything. That file on my laptop record is now 47 pages. I don't know if I'll ever need it. I hope I won't. But I learned something over 31 years of engineering. The structure you build when you have time is the one that holds when things go wrong. You don't build it during the emergency. You build it before. My birthday is in April. I'll be 64. Oliver has informed me, with great seriousness, that he is going to bring me a cake. He has not specified what kind of cake. I told him that any cake he brought me would be the best cake I'd ever had. He thought about that for a moment, and then nodded, satisfied, and went back to examining a beetle he'd found on my porch steps. That's enough for me. That's more than enough. I've been thinking about something Warren said to me near the end of all this. We were having lunch at the same diner we've been going to for 20 years, and I told him I felt a little strange about the whole thing. Like I'd won something I hadn't wanted to compete for in the first place. Warren put down his coffee cup and said, Frank, you didn't win. You just refused to lose. I've been sitting with that ever since. Here's what I know to be true. After 63 years of being alive and 31 of them spent in a profession where bad calculations have real consequences, the people who take advantage of patience are counting on patience looking like weakness. Clifton looked at my house and saw square footage. He looked at my age and saw someone who might back down to keep the peace. He looked at my love for my daughter and saw leverage. What he didn't see, because people like Clifton rarely do, was that I had already been paying attention for a long time, long before he started leaving voicemails at midnight. There's a version of this story where I got angry at that Thanksgiving table and said something I couldn't take back. There's another version where I kept the peace so hard that one morning I woke up with two strangers living in my guest room and no clear path to ask them to leave. I've known men who've ended up in both of those situations. Neither one ends well. What saved me from both was something simple. I decided early that my feelings about the situation were less important than my understanding of it. So I watched. I listened. I wrote things down. I called the man who knew the law, and when I found real information, the kind that actually solved the problem, I gave it to the person who needed it most, which was my daughter, not her husband. That's the thing about ethics that nobody talks about enough. It's not about being the loudest person in the room or the one who draws the hardest line. It's about doing the next right thing again and again, even when it's slower and quieter than you'd like. I didn't expose Clifton by confronting him. I exposed him by finding the truth and letting Joanna hold it in her own hands and decide what to do with it. That's the only kind of accountability that actually sticks. And resilience. I want to say something about that word, because it gets used as if it means not hurting. It doesn't. There were nights during those weeks when I sat in this house that Helen and I built together and felt genuinely tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The loneliness of being the only adult in a situation who can see what's actually happening is a particular kind of hard, but I got up every morning. I walked my 2 miles. I tended my roses. I kept my record. Resilience isn't the absence of weight. It's just refusing to let the weight decide your next move. Oliver is going to be 3 in the fall. He still can't quite say grandpa right. It comes out something closer to Grandpa Frank, which he delivers with enormous authority, like it's an official title. Maybe it is. That's enough for me. More than enough.